It's night. The emperor is in his bedroom, alone. Outside the door are conspirators with clubs, scarves, and orders to kill. In a few minutes, the ruler of a great empire will be dead. But for what? Today, we will tell one of the most shocking and mysterious stories of the Russian monarchy. Paul I is the son of Catherine the Great. It would seem that his fate should have been brilliant, but from birth his life did not go according to the usual scenario. His mother practically did not let him participate in the affairs of government. Catherine II did not just dislike Paul, she frankly did not trust him. The reasons for this distrust accumulated over the years and eventually led to the fact that she secretly began to prepare the transfer of power not to her son, but to her grandson, Alexander, Paul's son. Why did she do this? Paul was a man with a difficult character. He was very resentful, irascible, and suspicious. Catherine thought that he was too emotional and would not be able to hold power in the country, especially after her long and stable reign. In her eyes, he was more of a problem than an heir. Paul was not shy about voicing his displeasure with his mother's actions. He was against many of her reforms, especially those that gave too much freedom to the nobility. This was dangerous for Catherine. She saw him as a threat to her political legacy. Catherine was well aware of how easy it was to lose the throne. She had overthrown her husband, Peter III. She was therefore very cautious about handing over power. Her main fear: if Paul became emperor, he might take revenge on her for all the years of her ouster. And his behavior only reinforced these fears. Grandson Alexander was obedient, intelligent, and brought up by her order. Catherine was personally involved in Alexander's upbringing. She chose his teachers, monitored his education and moral development. She believed that he combined the virtues of the dynasty and her own ideas. Alexander was polite, intelligent, calm, everything that, in her opinion, Paul lacked. It is rumored that Catherine drew up a special act, a manifesto on the transfer of the throne to Alexander. But this document was never made public. After her death, Paul's cronies found it and burned it, preventing Catherine's plan from coming to fruition. Catherine deliberately kept Paul out of power for 34 years, not allowing him to participate in any state reforms. This was an absolute record for the time of freezing an heir in Russian history. Alexander, at the time of his grandmother's death, was only 23 years old, and he himself did not know that he could become emperor before his father. He learnt about it already after Catherine's death, and refused. This plan of Catherine's could have changed the whole history of Russia, but it collapsed in one moment with the death of the empress. And Paul, having received the throne, began with revenge and toughening. He began with a cruel and symbolic act. He ordered to open the coffin of Catherine II and bury her next to her father, whom she had once overthrown. This was not just an act of revenge, it was a signal to everyone. Now everything will be my way. Paul immediately began to change the rules. He was resentful of everyone, his mother, the court, the army. He felt that his life had been stolen from him. That is why he began to rule harshly, like a man who had finally gained power and was now not going to yield to anyone. Fear became his main tool, but they feared him not because he was cruel, but because he was unpredictable. Today he could reward, tomorrow he could exile. One count said that he feared not for his life, but for his hair. Paul was so meticulous about the appearance of his courtiers. He controlled little things as if he were looking for a reason to punish them. Paul was not only a tyrant, he was a son who was never recognized. His rigidity was revenge for humiliation. His fear for order hid a personal tragedy. He spent his life proving himself worthy of a throne that was almost taken from him. Paul was obsessed with order. He believed that everyone in the country should live according to the statutes, strictly, precisely, without liberties. First of all, he brought order to the streets. Literally. He ordered officials and military men to greet each other according to the regulations, even on the street. That is, if an official met a general, he had to stop, stretch out, and salute, even if he was traveling with his family or carrying groceries. Those who disobeyed could be reprimanded or even punished. But what shocked people the most were his prohibitions, which seemed strange. For example, he forbade the wearing of fancy dresses, mustaches, and tailcoats, because he personally did not like it. Fashion was considered a French liberty, and France was the enemy at the time. Pavel literally dictated what to wear, how to cut my hair, and how to look. Violations were punishable by fines, dismissal, and sometimes even arrest. Appearance became a matter of state. Women cried when they were forced to throw away expensive dresses. Men with mustaches were stopped on the streets and forced to shave. But none of this was mere caprice. Paul believed that discipline on the outside brings order on the inside. He wanted Russia to look like an army, slim, orderly, under control. Paul built the state not as a country, but as a barracks, with regulations, punishments, and total obedience. Such rigidity frightened both the common people and the nobility, especially those who were used to the freedoms under Catherine. But this was only the beginning. All these new orders quickly turned the first admiration into irritation. Those who at first hoped that Paul would bring order soon realized he brings fear. This was especially felt by the nobility. It seemed to them that the emperor was simply avenging his past. He didn't listen, he didn't consult, he didn't respect merit. He ordered. Paul began to interfere in the lives of the most influential people in the country, breaking the habitual way in which they had lived for decades. His strict rules, humiliations, and unexpected punishments became a real nightmare for those who had recently felt untouchable. He literally controlled everything: how one stood, how one spoke, how one dressed. An officer could be fired just because his button was not shiny enough. For any offense, even a minor one, they could put you in a fortress. And it didn't matter whether you were an ordinary officer or a count with a pedigree. Such an attitude of Paul caused real fury. People who were used to respect and freedom began to feel like in the brig. Even the nobles tried not to stand out, not to say too much, and not to get in front of the emperor. Paul inadvertently turned the elite into his enemies, although initially he wanted only discipline. He destroyed the main thing that held power, the trust between the emperor and the upper classes. The longer Paul I ruled, the more his laws began to resemble personal whims rather than politics. He did not just rule the country. It was as if he was trying to remake everyone for himself. His orders reached absurdity, and no one knew what tomorrow you can get in disfavor. One of his first decrees concerned the sleep regime. Paul ordered that everyone should go to bed at 9 p.m. This applied even to the nobility. If the lights in the house were on later, the guards could come and ask, "Why aren't you sleeping?" People started extinguishing candles in advance, out of fear. He also restricted travel. It became almost impossible to travel abroad. Traveling to France was considered especially suspicious because of the revolution there. French books were banned. An officer could be arrested simply because a book in French was found in his possession. It didn't matter whether it was fiction or botany. The very fact was already considered a danger to the empire. But it was his decrees in the sphere of culture and everyday life that shocked people the most. Women were officially forbidden to dance the mazurka. Paul considered this dance too free and inappropriate. Dance evenings became much more boring, especially suffered young girls, for whom the ball was the only chance to meet a future husband. He even began to ban certain colors and styles of clothing. Anything that resembled France or free spirit was forbidden. This meant that yesterday's fancy dress could become a reason for punishment. Paul considered any manifestation of freedom, even in dancing or reading, a threat to the state. These laws seemed to others not only strict, but strange and frightening. People started hiding books, whispering in the evenings, and were afraid to make an unnecessary movement. When a ruler has no support among the military, he will not last long. Paul I, himself a man of military rigor, it would seem that he should have been close to the army. But instead he quarreled with most of the generals and turned the army into his enemy. First he began with external discipline, line reviews, uniforms, step, turns. Everything had to be perfect. He forced soldiers to retrain in the Prussian system, which he considered the only correct. Many officers, hardened in battle, were shocked. Instead of preparing for war, they practiced marching for 8 hours a day. The generals also ran out of patience. Alexander Suvorov, the main hero of Russian victories, openly disagreed with Paul's methods. He was against the army on display and wanted real action. In response, Paul fired Suvorov and actually forced him to leave the country. This was a blow to Russia. The general, who was respected by the whole of Europe, was simply dismissed. But that was only the beginning. Paul began to change the command, dismissing honored officers and appointing those who he personally liked. At military training camps, there were cases when generals were scolded for holding a sword incorrectly or speaking out of order. Soldiers began to complain. Officers were silent but angry. To top it all off, Paul began making strange foreign policy plans. The most shocking of them was the idea of going on a campaign to India together with Napoleon, whom only recently Russia had considered an enemy. This proposal seemed like madness. Why go across deserts and mountains to Asia to fight over lands that did not concern Russia at all? The military realized their lives could be sacrificed to unpredictable ideas. The army was offended, the nobles were humiliated, the people were intimidated. Paul became increasingly withdrawn and believed only those who told him what he wanted to hear. But behind his back, those who had once sworn an oath to him began to whisper. Discontent began to turn into danger. By early 1801, Paul had many faces around him, but fewer and fewer true allies. He trusted almost no one and changed his cronies frequently. But the worst of it was that the people who kissed his hand daily were secretly already looking for a way to remove him. A conspiracy against Paul began to be prepared by his own generals and courtiers, whom he had previously considered reliable. Many of them were humiliated, removed from power, or simply tired of living in fear. They realized that it was useless to wait for change. The main role was taken by Generals Benison and Palin, influential and experienced men. And they were not alone. The most surprising thing is that the conspiracy was supported by the Metropolitan. The church, which should stand behind the power, this time went against it. The Metropolitan blessed the conspirators, saying, "If for the sake of Russia's salvation, it is not a sin." This was a signal. It is possible and necessary to remove Paul. But the intrigue did not end there. To speed up the action, Paul was planted a forged letter, allegedly from officers, which said that he was going to be killed. The goal was the same, to make him even more afraid and lose control. The plan worked. Paul became nervous, withdrawn, started changing guards and even hiding. But the real threat was already at the door. The conspirators behaved cautiously but determinedly. They sought the approval of those who could influence the situation, and such a person was found, the heir to the throne, Paul's son Alexander. He was not directly involved, but he knew everything, and most importantly, he didn't stop it. The conspirators had prepared everything. The only thing left was to act. The moment was not chosen by chance. It was night when the palace was almost empty, the guards were scattered, and the emperor himself was in his chambers unaccompanied. Paul felt that there was a danger hanging over him, but did not know where it would strike from. The night from 11th to 12th March, 1801. Paul. I is in the Mikhailovsky castle. He does not sleep well, feels anxious, and even locks the bedroom doors for the night. But this does not save him. He has already been betrayed. Even the guards he trusted have been ordered not to interfere when the guests enter the bedroom. At about 2 o'clock in the morning, a group of conspirators moves along the narrow, dark corridors to Paul's chambers. There are 12 of them, almost all of them military. They are armed not with sabers and guns, but with clubs and scarves. Their goal is not a fight, but a quiet liquidation. At this moment, no one thinks about the law, only about how to finish the case as quickly as possible. The door to the emperor's room was closed, but they broke it down. Paul woke up to a noise. He tried to hide behind a screen and even climbed into the fireplace, hoping they wouldn't find him. But he was pulled out. A short fight ensued. The emperor called for help, shouting, "What have I done to you?" But no one came. He was beaten, strangled with a scarf, and in a few minutes he was dead. None of the murderers were punished. On the contrary, they were rewarded and honored. And Pavel's body lay on the floor of his room until morning. In the morning, his body was found in the palace, but there were no traces of the struggle. Everything was quickly cleaned up. The conspirators did not hide, on the contrary, they walked the halls like victors. The question, who will rule now, was not even discussed. The answer was obvious: his son Alexander, whom Paul himself prepared as heir, but who knew about the conspiracy and did nothing to stop it. On the morning of the 12th of March, 1801, Alexander I became the new emperor. He came out to the people with a polite speech, promised to return calm, remove cruelty, and do everything according to justice. People exhaled, but little did they know that he knew of the plot in advance. Not personally involved, but he didn't stop it. And it was this burden that he would live with for the rest of his life. He would later tell his cronies, "I sold out my father." What became of the conspirators? They stayed at court, gaining positions and respect. Many lived to a ripe old age, none of them responsible for strangling the emperor in his bedroom. It became a tacit rule. If you stage a coup, do it quickly and surely, and then no one will touch you. Paul's death changed many things. The country became softer, but also more fearful. The authorities realized that if a ruler became inconvenient, he could be removed. Without a trial, without revolutions, without popular protest. Just quietly, in one night. Paul's assassination was the first legal change of power by the hands of the elite, without the participation of the people. The new Tsar came to the throne not as an heir, but as a man who had done nothing to save his father. After Paul's death, many things returned back to normal. Removed strict prohibitions, returned fashion, softened the statutes. People breathed more freely. But in the depths of power happened something much more important than the change of emperor. After Paul, every new emperor lived with the thought that he too could be removed. Nicholas I, Alexander II, Alexander III. All of them strengthened their guards, feared conspiracies, almost did not trust their entourage. Power became not a symbol of strength, but a symbol of risk. The emperor became a hostage of the system, where everyone looks at him and waits, whether he is convenient or not. If he is uncomfortable, he can be replaced. And it doesn't have to be from the outside, it's enough to negotiate with their own. This murder left a mark on the entire Romanov dynasty. Paul's son, Alexander I, felt guilty all his life and eventually left power, actually hiding from society. His grandson, Alexander II, also died from violence, but no longer from conspirators in uniform, but from revolutionaries. The story of Paul the Fawn is not just a tale of a tough ruler. It is the tragedy of a man who wanted to change the country, but was disliked by those who were in power before him. He came with a desire to restore order, but the methods he chose turned against him. He didn't fight his enemies. He fought the system he grew up in. He didn't lose on the battlefield. He was killed by his own people in his bedroom. His death showed the whole of Russia that even an emperor can become a victim if he stops being convenient. Paul I is remembered as cruel, strange, and unpredictable. But behind this image was a man who was pushed away all his life, first by his mother, then by society, and finally by the army and his own son. He was a victim of the fear that he himself had created. If you were interested, don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss the next episodes about the fate of great people.